Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The barometric pressure readings made no sense. Stephen Torres had been staring at the data for 20 minutes, cross-referencing 3 different weather stations, and the numbers refused to reconcile themselves with physical reality. According to the National Weather Service station at Lake Quinault, atmospheric pressure had held steady at 30.12 inches of mercury throughout the previous 72 hours. The portable units he'd installed along the Hoh River Trail told the same story, except for Station 4, positioned at mile marker 8.3, which reported a consistent 27.89 inches. That kind of pressure differential didn't exist in nature, not without a hurricane, and there hadn't been so much as a strong breeze in the Olympic National Park for the past week. Stephen pulled up the maintenance logs on his laptop, searching for equipment malfunction reports. Station 4 was a Davis Vantage Pro 2, less than 8 months old, calibrated in April with 0 drift noted during the last 3 check-ins. He'd installed it himself, mounted on a western hemlock 50 yards from the trail, high enough to avoid vandalism but accessible enough for monthly servicing. The unit transmitted data every 15 minutes via a Motorola mesh network that had proven bulletproof in 2 years of operation. The coffee in his thermos had gone cold. Outside the ranger station window, October rain fell in gray sheets across the Hoh rainforest, turning the moss-draped trees into watercolor smudges. Stephen had spent 6 years as the park's climatology specialist, building a network of sensors that tracked weather patterns with precision that made the university researchers jealous. His data fed into regional climate models. His forecasts had a 93% accuracy rate. He did not make mistakes, and his equipment did not lie. But Station 4 was lying, or the laws of physics were temporarily suspended at mile marker 8.3. He opened a new window and pulled up the incident reports from the past 3 months. Something he'd been avoiding since the call came in that morning about Kayla Morrison. 26 years old, experienced hiker, last seen on the Hoh River Trail 3 days ago. Her car was still in the parking lot, registration current, no signs of trouble. Standard missing person case, except Stephen had started noticing a pattern. July 19th. Douglas Brennan, 52, disappeared near mile marker 8. Found 2 days later, hypothermic and incoherent, claiming the trail had moved on him. August 3rd, Nina Volkov, 34, missing for 18 hours near mile marker 7.5, located by SR team in a state of severe dehydration, unable to explain how she'd ended up 4 miles off trail, despite carrying a Garmin GPS Map 64. August 29th. Twins Marcus and Gabriel Ortiz, both 16, rescued after spending a night walking in circles around mile marker 9. Both insisted their compass had been working fine. September 14th, Kayla Morrison's boyfriend James Peterson, found unconscious near the same area. Released from the hospital with a diagnosis of exhaustion, but Stephen had read the EMT notes. Peterson's core temperature had been 94, 2 degrees Fahrenheit despite mild weather, and he'd had bark embedded under his fingernails as if he'd been clawing at trees. Now Kayla was gone, and Stephen's weather station was reporting impossible data from the exact center of what was starting to look less like a coincidence cluster and more like a kill zone. He pulled up the satellite imagery, overlaying the incident locations onto the topographic map. They formed a rough circle, approximately 1.3 miles in diameter, centered on a section of old-growth forest that hadn't been surveyed in detail since the 1970s. The trees there were ancient, Sitka spruce and western hemlock that had been seedlings when Columbus reached the Americas. The forest floor received less than 10% of available sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. Stephen zoomed in on the satellite feed, studying the texture of the forest. Something looked wrong about the tree distribution in that area. The spacing was too regular, almost geometric, forming patterns that his eye wanted to trace but couldn't quite follow. He adjusted the image contrast and felt something cold settle in his chest. The trees weren't randomly positioned. They formed what looked like a massive spiral, hundreds of trees arranged in a pattern that swept inward, toward a central point directly beneath where Station 4 was mounted. He pulled back from the laptop, blinking hard. Pattern recognition was a survival mechanism, he reminded himself. The human brain was designed to find meaning in randomness, to see faces in clouds and conspiracies in coincidence. Old-growth forests often developed interesting distribution patterns based on soil nutrients, water availability, sunlight exposure. There was nothing supernatural about trees growing in a spiral. It was just biology, except his weather station was reporting impossible pressure readings, and 5 people had gotten catastrophically lost in the same small area in less than 3 months, and Stephen's hands were shaking as he reached for his radio. Torres to dispatch, over. Static, then. Go ahead, Torres. I'm heading out to check Station 4 on the Ho River Trail. Should be back by 1700 hours. Over. A pause. Copy that. Weather's supposed to get worse this afternoon. You sure you don't want to wait until tomorrow? Stephen looked at the data again, at the impossible numbers that had been streaming in for 3 days while Kayla Morrison was somewhere in that forest, probably injured, definitely afraid. The rational part of his brain, the part that had earned him a master's degree in atmospheric science from the University of Washington, was screaming at him to call SAR, to bring in a full team, to approach this systematically. But SAR had already swept the area twice. They'd found nothing, and Stephen's weather station kept transmitting data that couldn't exist, and something was wrong with the trees in that forest, and he needed to see it for himself before he went to the park superintendent with a theory that would make him sound insane. Negative, dispatch. Need to check the equipment before the university team arrives next week. Torres out. He packed his field kit with mechanical precision, pushing away the tremor in his fingers. Garmin GPS fully charged. Motorola XPR 755D radio with spare battery. Emergency beacon. First aid kit. Water purification tablets. Mylar emergency blanket. Weatherproof matches. Bench-made bushcrafter knife. Everything he needed to handle a routine maintenance call in a forest he'd walked 100 times. The rain had intensified by the time he reached the trailhead parking lot. Kayla Morrison's Toyota 4Runner sat alone in the lot, water beading on its dark blue paint. Stephen pulled on his rain gear and cinched the hood tight, then spent 5 minutes programming waypoints into his GPS. The device's screen glowed reassuringly, showing his position with satellite-confirmed accuracy within 3 meters. The Ho River Trail began as a well-maintained path through temperate rainforest, the kind of scenery that ended up on postcards and tourism websites. Massive trees dripped with club moss and ferns, their trunks wider than Stephen was tall. The sound of rain on leaves created a susurrus that drowned out everything else. Footsteps, breathing, thoughts. He'd always found the forest peaceful, a living cathedral where science and beauty intersected perfectly. Today it felt like walking into a mouth. Stephen checked his GPS every few minutes, confirming his position against the known trail coordinates. The device worked flawlessly, tracking his progress with comforting precision. Mile marker 1. Mile marker 2. The trail wound through stands of cedar and hemlock, crossing small streams on wooden bridges that park maintenance kept in good repair. Everything was exactly as it should be. At mile marker 3, he noticed the moss. It took him a moment to identify what had caught his attention. Stephen had studied the vegetation patterns in this forest extensively. His thesis had included a comprehensive survey of epiphyte distribution. He knew that club moss typically grew on the northern and western sides of trees, following the prevailing wind patterns that brought moisture from the Pacific. But here, for about 50 yards of trail, the moss grew only on the eastern sides of the trunks, as if the wind had reversed direction for this small section of forest. He stopped and ran his hand over the nearest trunk. The moss was thick and healthy, unmistakably thriving despite its wrong-sided orientation. Stephen pulled out his compass, checking the reading against his GPS. Both agreed on the cardinal directions. The moss was simply growing in the wrong place. A tree didn't know what direction was wrong. It responded to environmental conditions, light, moisture, nutrient availability. For the moss to grow this way, the microclimate in this area would have to be fundamentally different from the surrounding forest, and there was no topographic or meteorological reason for that to be true. Stephen photographed the phenomenon, making sure to capture the GPS coordinates in the frame, then continued walking. His field of vision seemed to narrow, the forest pressing in from both sides. The sound of rain on leaves had changed timbre, becoming something almost rhythmic, almost like breathing. At mile marker 5, he found the first mark. Someone had carved a symbol into the bark of a western hemlock about 6 feet off the ground. Stephen approached it slowly, studying the cut. Fresh sap still wept from the incision, which meant the mark was recent, probably within the last few days. The symbol itself made his skin crawl in a way he couldn't immediately explain. It looked like a spiral with 3 arms, each arm terminating in a hook that curled back on itself. The lines were deep and confident, made with something sharp and heavy, probably a large knife or small hatchet. He'd seen similar marks before, in the anthropology section of the university library, while researching indigenous symbology for a paper on traditional weather prediction methods. This particular design wasn't Native American. It looked Eastern European, possibly Slavic, the kind of protective charm that farmers once carved into barn doors to ward off forest spirits. Stephen pulled out his radio. "Torres to dispatch, over." Static. He adjusted the frequency and tried again. More static, with an underlying tone that sounded almost like wind through trees, except there was no wind. "Dispatch, this is Torres. Radio check, over." Nothing. He checked the battery indicator. Full charge. Signal strength showed 5 bars. The radio was working perfectly, but nobody was answering. Stephen marked the symbol's location in his GPS and continued walking, feeling the weight of the forest around him growing heavier. The rational explanation was radio interference from the terrain, even though he'd never had communication problems on this trail before. The weather station at mile marker 8. 3 was still a mile ahead, still transmitting its impossible data. At mile marker 6, he found 3 more symbols carved into trees, forming a rough triangle around the trail. At mile marker 7, there were 9, arranged in what looked like deliberate pattern. 3 groups of 3, forming a larger triangle that encompassed about 50 square yards of forest. The freshness of the sap suggested all the symbols had been carved within the past week. Someone had been out here, working systematically, marking the forest with protective charms in the exact area where people kept getting lost. Stephen's radio crackled suddenly, making him jump. Through the static came a voice, female, young, frightened. "Can't find the trail anymore, the trees keep..." "This is Ranger Torres," Stephen transmitted, his heart hammering. "Identify yourself. What's your location? Over." "Moving. They're moving. Every time I turn around, they've..." "Say again your last. Are you Kayla Morrison? Over." "Help me, please. The trees won't let me." The transmission cut off, replaced by static that resolved into a sound Stephen's brain refused to properly interpret. It was like wind, but with a pattern to it, almost like syllables in a language he'd never heard. The sound made his teeth ache and his vision blur. He shut off the radio. The silence that followed was worse than the static. Stephen became aware that the rain had stopped, or perhaps it had never been raining at all beneath the canopy. Water still dripped from the leaves overhead, but the drops fell in a rhythm that seemed deliberate, timed, almost like Morse code. His GPS showed he was at mile marker 7.4, less than a mile from Station 4. The trail ahead looked narrower than it should, the undergrowth pressing in from both sides. Stephen couldn't remember the vegetation being this thick, couldn't remember having to push branches aside just to keep walking. He checked his GPS again, still at mile marker 7.4, despite walking for what felt like 5 minutes. He looked back at the trail behind him and saw only forest. No clear path, just trees and ferns and moss-covered logs forming an impassable tangle. The trail was gone. Stephen pulled up the waypoints he'd marked in his GPS, orienting himself toward Station 4's location. The device showed him walking in the right direction, following a bearing of 287 degrees northwest, but the forest around him didn't match the satellite imagery he'd studied. The trees were too dense, their spacing too deliberate, their trunks all facing slightly inward as if watching him. He pushed through a curtain of sword ferns and found himself in a small clearing he'd never seen before. At the center stood a western hemlock that must have been 800 years old, its trunk wider than his arm span, its lowest branches 40 feet above the ground. The moss on this tree grew in a spiral pattern, wrapping around the trunk like a barber pole, defying every principle of phototropism Stephen had ever studied. Carved into the bark at eye level, repeated hundreds of times in a band that circled the entire trunk, was the three-armed spiral symbol. The carvings were old here, weathered by decades of growth, the bark having healed around the cuts in lumpy scar tissue. This wasn't recent vandalism. Someone had marked this tree generations ago. Stephen's GPS suddenly showed his position as stationary, despite his continued walking. Then the coordinates began to change in ways that made no sense. North becoming south, east becoming west. The numbers cycling through values that placed him simultaneously in multiple locations. The device's satellite lock icon flickered and died. Technology was failing. The forest was winning. He pulled out his compass, watching the needle spin lazily before settling on a direction that his GPS had just indicated was south, but his own sense of orientation insisted was east. Stephen had spent years trusting instruments over instinct, but now his instruments were lying to him, and his instincts were screaming that he needed to leave this place immediately. The trees around the clearing had formed a perfect circle. Stephen counted them mechanically, trying to focus on something concrete. 17 trees, all the same species, all the same approximate age, all with their lowest branches extending toward the center of the clearing like grasping fingers. The statistical probability of this occurring naturally was effectively zero. Something moved in his peripheral vision. Stephen spun, his hand dropping to the knife on his belt, but saw only trees. Except the trees were in different positions than they had been a moment ago. He was certain of it. The hemlock with the scarred bark had been on his left, and now it was behind him. The clearing had rotated, or he had rotated, or space itself had twisted in a way that made his inner ear scream and his stomach lurch. "This isn't real," he said aloud, his voice strange in the dead air. "This is hypoxia or hypothermia or some kind of neurological event." The trees swayed despite the absence of wind. In the pattern of their movement, Stephen saw what he'd been avoiding seeing in the satellite imagery. The spiral, always the spiral, trees arranged in a pattern that drew the eye inward and downward into some central point that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. His field kit's barometer showed 27.89 inches of mercury, the same reading as his weather station, the same impossible reading. Stephen forced himself to breathe slowly, to think. He had a master's degree in atmospheric science. He understood weather systems, pressure gradients, the behavior of air masses. He did not believe in forest spirits or protective charms or trees that moved when you weren't looking. There had to be a rational explanation. Except rational explanations didn't account for the voice he'd heard on the radio, or the symbols carved into bark, or the fact that his GPS was now showing his elevation as negative 400 feet below sea level, despite standing on solid ground. The trees moved again. This time Stephen watched it happen. Not a sudden jump, but a slow rotation, trunks pivoting in the soil like dancers in a choreographed performance. They were closing in, narrowing the circle, and Stephen realized with absolute clarity that if he stayed in this clearing much longer, the circle would contract to a point and he would simply cease to exist in any meaningful way. He ran. The forest resisted. Branches caught at his clothing. Roots appeared beneath his feet. Ferns whipped across his face with enough force to draw blood. Stephen crashed through the undergrowth, no longer caring about direction or GPS coordinates or maintaining proper search and rescue protocols. His only goal was motion, was getting away from the clearing with the impossible tree and its spiral of scar tissue. He emerged onto what looked like the trail, except the trail was different now. The packed earth had been replaced by soft moss that muffled his footsteps. The trees on either side had trunks that curved inward, forming a tunnel that seemed to recede infinitely into the distance. Stephen's radio crackled again, and this time the voice was clear. "You shouldn't be here," Kayla Morrison said. "This place doesn't want you here." "Where are you?" Stephen demanded, spinning in a circle, seeing no one. "Kayla, What's your position? I'm where I've always been, where we've all been. The Leshy keeps us. The what? The Guardian, the Leshy. It has 100 names in 100 languages. The old woman from Forks tried to warn me. She said her grandmother remembered the stories. Settlers from Siberia who came to work the timber camps, they knew about the guardians of the old forests. They carved the marks to ask permission, to show respect. But I didn't understand. I just thought she was a crazy old woman telling fairy tales. Stephen's hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the radio. Kayla, none of that is real. You're experiencing severe disorientation, possibly hypothermia. Stay where you are and keep talking. I can triangulate your position from the radio signal. Laughter, high and strained. You still think your science matters here? You still think your instruments can measure what's happening? How long have you been walking, Ranger Torres? 2 hours? 3? Stephen checked his watch. The digital display showed 2:47 p.m., which meant he'd been on the trail for almost 4 hours despite his subjective sense that only 90 minutes had passed. Except his watch had said 2:47 p.m. 15 minutes ago. Time was malfunctioning along with space. The Leshy controls the forest, Kayla continued, her voice drifting in and out like a poorly tuned station. It can make paths appear and disappear. It can make you walk in circles forever, always seeing the same trees, always thinking you're making progress. It feeds on the confusion, the fear, the slow realization that you're never leaving. That's not... Stephen stopped himself. What could he say? That it wasn't real? He was standing in a forest where trees moved and compasses lied and time ran backward. Reality had become negotiable. There's a way out, Kayla said, her voice dropping to a whisper. But you have to give it something. Give what something? The forest wants to know you understand, that you respect its age, its power. You have to make an offering. Stephen laughed, a sound that came out more like a sob. I'm not performing some kind of primitive ritual. I'm a scientist. So was I, Kayla said. I had a PhD in ecology from Oregon State. I spent 3 years studying old-growth forest dynamics. I knew everything about these trees, their root systems, their nutrient cycling, their competition for light. I knew everything except what they really were. What are they? Silence on the radio, long enough that Stephen thought the connection had been lost. Then, they're the fingers of something much larger. Something that's been here since before there were humans to name it. The Leshy isn't a creature, Ranger Torres. It's the forest's consciousness, and we're insects walking through its thoughts. The radio went dead. Stephen tried every frequency, every channel, but received only static. His GPS had given up entirely, showing an error message about satellite acquisition failure. The compass needle spun slowly, completing a full rotation every 30 seconds. He was alone with no working navigation equipment in a forest that was actively hostile to his presence, and the only person who seemed to understand what was happening had just told him he needed to make an offering to an ancient Slavic forest spirit that couldn't possibly exist. Stephen closed his eyes and tried to remember his training. When all technology failed, you relied on natural navigation, the sun's position, the growth patterns of moss, the flow of water. He opened his eyes and looked up, searching for the sun through the canopy. The trees overhead had woven their branches together, forming a lattice so dense that no light penetrated. The forest floor existed in permanent twilight, a green gloom that made depth perception impossible. Stephen couldn't tell if the hemlock 20 feet ahead was actually 20 feet away or 200. Water. He could follow water downhill, which would eventually lead him to the Hoh River, which followed a known course back to the ranger station. Stephen listened for the sound of running water and heard it immediately, a stream burbling somewhere to his left. He pushed through the undergrowth toward the sound. The stream was flowing uphill. Stephen stood on its bank watching water defy gravity, flowing from low ground to high ground with perfect consistency. He knelt and put his hand in the flow, feeling the water move against his palm, cold and real and absolutely impossible. "You're starting to understand," said a voice behind him. Stephen whirled, his knife in his hand, before he'd consciously decided to draw it. The man standing 10 feet away looked to be in his 70s, wearing clothes that might have been contemporary 50 years ago. Wool trousers, a flannel shirt, suspenders. His face was weathered like tree bark, and his eyes were the color of moss. "Who are you?" Stephen demanded. "Does it matter?" The old man smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, packed too tightly in his mouth. "You came to check your weather station, the one that reports pressure readings that shouldn't exist. Did you ever wonder why the pressure is so low in this area?" "Equipment malfunction," Stephen said automatically, though he no longer believed it. "The Leshy breathes," the old man said. "In and out, in and out. A cycle measured in decades. Right now, it's inhaling, drawing everything inward. Your barometer measures that breath. That's not how atmospheric pressure works." "Are you certain?" The old man took a step closer. His feet made no sound on the forest floor, left no impressions in the moss. "You've built a career on certainty, on measurement, on the belief that nature follows laws you can quantify. But laws are human constructs, Ranger Torres. Nature predates law. It predates consciousness itself, at least consciousness as you understand it." Stephen backed away, keeping the knife between himself and the old man. "You're not real. You're a hallucination caused by hypoxia or hypothermia or some kind of environmental toxin. I'm as real as you allow me to be." The old man's smile widened. "The Leshy takes many forms. Sometimes it's a voice in the trees. Sometimes it's the trees themselves. Sometimes it's an old man who worked these forests when your grandfather was young. The form doesn't matter. The message does." "What message?" "You don't belong here. Your science, your instruments, your certainty, they're intrusions on something ancient and vast and utterly indifferent to human understanding. The forest tolerates your presence when you stay on the paths, when you take your samples and measurements and leave. But you've come too deep, stayed too long. You've tried to measure what cannot be measured." Stephen's back hit a tree. He hadn't realized he'd been retreating. The bark pressed against his spine, rough and solid and real. Where's Kayla Morrison? Where she chose to be. Where everyone who enters the Leshy's heart must eventually choose to be, part of the forest or apart from it. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give. The Leshy doesn't think in terms of location or time. It thinks in terms of belonging. Your friend understood that eventually. She stopped fighting. She accepted. She became. The old man's outline was starting to blur, his features running like watercolors in rain. Stephen blinked hard, trying to clear his vision, but the dissolution continued. Within seconds, what had been a man was just a column of moss and bark, just another tree in a forest of trees. And Stephen couldn't remember why he'd been afraid. His field kit's emergency beacon was still functional. Stephen pulled it out with numb fingers, staring at the device that would transmit his position to any search and rescue team within 100 miles. All he had to do was activate it, and within a few hours he'd be extracted. He'd be safe. But Kayla would still be out here, and Douglas Brennan, and Nina Volkov, and the Ortiz twins, and all the others who'd gotten lost in this spiral of ancient trees. Stephen had come out here to investigate, to apply his scientific training to a problem that defied scientific explanation, and he'd failed, completely. He was going to die in this forest unless he accepted what the old man had said, that some things existed beyond measurement, beyond law, beyond human comprehension. Stephen looked at the emergency beacon for a long moment, then clipped it back onto his belt without activating it. Instead, he pulled out his knife and approached the nearest hemlock. The blade was sharp, designed for survival situations, capable of cutting through rope or processing firewood. He pressed the tip against the bark and began to carve. The three-armed spiral came easily, his hand following a pattern it shouldn't have known. As he worked, Stephen spoke aloud, words that felt like translation from some older language. "I acknowledge your age. I acknowledge your power. I acknowledge my insignificance in the face of what cannot be measured." The knife bit deep, sap welling like blood. Stephen completed the spiral and added his own modification, his initials small and humble at the bottom of the symbol. Not a claim of ownership or mastery, but a recognition that he had been here, that he had learned. The forest sighed. It was an actual sound, a rustling that moved through every branch and leaf. a wind that touched Stephen's face despite the absolute stillness of the air. His compass needle stopped spinning and pointed north. His GPS flickered back to life, showing his position with satellite-confirmed accuracy. The trail reappeared clear and unmistakable, leading back the way he'd come. Stephen looked at the symbol he'd carved, then at the forest around him. The trees no longer seemed hostile. They were simply trees, ancient and patient and utterly unconcerned with human categories of possible and impossible. He'd spent his career measuring the forest, quantifying it, reducing it to data points and statistical models. He'd never considered that the forest might be measuring him in return. His radio crackled. "Torres, this is dispatch. We've been trying to reach you for 2 hours. What's your status?" "Over." Stephen lifted the radio, his voice surprisingly steady. "Torres here. I'm at mile marker 8.3. The weather station is functioning correctly. No equipment malfunction. Over." "Copy that. Are you heading back now?" He looked deeper into the forest toward where the trees formed their spiral pattern, toward where Kayla Morrison was either dead or transformed, or existing in some state beyond human definition. Stephen could activate his emergency beacon. He could bring in a full search team with helicopters and thermal imaging and every piece of technology that modern rescue operations could deploy, and the Leshy would simply hide what it wanted to hide, move what it wanted to move, ensure that all the searching in the world would find only forest. "Negative, dispatch," Stephen said. "I'm continuing to Station 4 for complete diagnostics. We'll return before dark. Torres out." He clipped the radio to his belt and began walking deeper into the forest, following the spiral inward. The trees welcomed him with silence. His instruments functioned perfectly now, tracking his progress with precision, but Stephen no longer trusted their measurements. He'd learned that some things couldn't be quantified, not because they were supernatural or impossible, but because they operated on principles that human science had simply never encountered. The Leshy breathed, and Stephen walked through its breath, feeling the pressure drop with each step deeper into the old growth. His barometer confirmed what his body already knew. The air was thinner here, the world less substantial, the boundary between physical and metaphysical growing permeable. At the center of the spiral, he found his weather station still dutifully transmitting data, and beneath it, arranged in a circle, were 5 backpacks, 5 sets of supplies, 5 people who had walked into this forest and chosen not to leave. Stephen added his own pack to the collection. He carved another symbol on the hemlock that hosted his weather station, making it official. Then he continued walking, following a path that appeared with each step and disappeared behind him, leading him deeper into a forest that was simultaneously located in Olympic National Park and in some older, stranger place that had existed before maps were drawn. His last conscious thought as the trees closed around him was that his weather data would continue transmitting, would continue showing impossible readings, and some future ranger would eventually come to investigate. They would find his symbols carved into bark. They would hear voices on the radio. They would have to make their own choice about what can be measured and what must simply be acknowledged. The Leshy welcomed Stephen Torres into its eternal breath, and the forest grew by one more tree. 3 days later, a search and rescue team found Stephen's truck in the trailhead parking lot, his personal effects secured inside, his duty log noting his intention to serve as Weather Station 4. They swept the trail thoroughly, found nothing but some unusual carved symbols on various trees. The weather station at mile marker 8.3 continued transmitting data. 27. 89 inches of mercury, consistent and impossible. A mystery that would eventually be filed away as equipment malfunction because the alternative was too disturbing to consider. Nobody mentioned that the satellite imagery now showed 18 trees in that perfect circle instead of 17. Nobody mentioned that the newest tree had bark patterns that, if you looked at them from the right angle, almost resembled a human face. The forest kept its secrets and the Leshy breathed in and the spiral grew tighter. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Stephen. Robert Fitzgerald had mapped 17 disappearances before he noticed the trees. Not their locations, those were already plotted in his GIS software, red pins scattered across the Hoh rainforest like drops of blood on moss. It was their orientation that made his coffee go cold. Every Sitka spruce within 100 yards of each disappearance site leaned 15 degrees southeast. Every single one. In a forest where wind patterns, soil composition, and drainage should create random growth variations, 17 separate locations showed identical angular deviation. The statistical probability hovered somewhere near impossible. Robert had spent 8 years as a GIS analyst for the National Park Service, the last 3 stationed at Olympic. He'd built predictive models for landslides, tracked invasive species migration, and mapped every trail system in the park down to deer paths. He believed in data. Data didn't lie, didn't exaggerate, didn't succumb to the superstitious nonsense the old-timers loved to whisper about the deep forest. But data was telling him something profoundly wrong was happening in the Hoh. The latest disappearance, Connor Burke, 26, experienced backcountry camper, had been reported 3 days ago. His permit listed a solo trek along the Hoh River Trail, planning to camp near the Blue Glacier Overlook. His GPS tracker showed him reaching the coordinates, then stopped transmitting at 11:47 p.m. on October 23, 2011. Not gradually losing signal, just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. Robert pulled up the topographic overlay on his monitor. Connor's last known position sat dead center of what Robert had started calling the Southeast Zone, a roughly circular area, 8 miles in diameter, where the tree lean was most pronounced. Where all 17 disappearances had occurred over the past 9 years. His supervisor, Linda Morrison, had dismissed the pattern when Robert first presented it. Trees lean toward light, Fitz. That's biology, not mystery. But Robert had shown her the canopy density analysis, the light penetration models. The southeast lean couldn't be explained by phototropism. The forest was equally dense in all directions. She'd assigned him to assist with the Connor Burke search anyway, probably hoping fieldwork would cure him of what she called his XL fever. The SAR team was assembling at the Hoh Ranger Station at 0600. Robert had volunteered to hike in early, scout the area with his handheld GPS and mark probable search grids. What he didn't tell Linda was that he intended to document every tree within Connor's last known position. Build an irrefutable data set. Science would explain this. It always did. The October dawn came late to the rainforest, filtered through 500 feet of old-growth canopy into something dim and green. Robert reached the trailhead at 5:30 a.m., headlamp cutting through fog so thick it seemed solid. The Hoh River Trail was one of the park's most maintained routes, wide and well-marked. But even here the moss grew aggressive, coating every surface, muffling sound, making the forest feel less like wilderness and more like the interior of some vast, quiet organism. His pack carried the essentials: Garmin GPS Map 64's digital compass rangefinder, two-way Motorola radio, backup batteries, first aid kit, emergency beacon, plus his laptop in a waterproof case, external hard drive with all his mapping data, and a small but expensive LiDAR scanner he'd borrowed from the University of Washington Geology Department. If he could get detailed elevation and spatial data from the Southeast Zone, he might finally understand what geological formation could cause such uniform tree distortion. The trail followed the river, milky blue-green with glacial sediment. Elk tracks crossed and recrossed the path. A Roosevelt elk, massive rack disappearing into the understory, watched him pass with eyes that seemed too aware, too focused. Robert had seen hundreds of elk in the park. This one made his fingers itch for the bear spray on his hip strap. At mile marker 4, he stopped. According to his GPS, Connor Burke's last transmission had originated 2.3 miles northeast of this point, off-trail through unmanaged forest. Robert marked a waypoint, then studied his digital compass. The needle pointed north. Steady, reliable. He'd check it every few minutes during the hike. Compasses could malfunction, magnetic anomalies could exist. But his was a high-end survey model, calibrated monthly. He left the trail. The forest changed within 50 yards. The maintained path's broad openness gave way to claustrophobic density. Massive nurse logs, fallen giants supporting gardens of younger trees, created mazes of wood and fungus. Devil's Club, its thorns legendary, formed impenetrable barriers. Robert had to detour repeatedly, checking his GPS to maintain bearing. Progress slowed to a crawl. After 40 minutes, he'd covered maybe half a mile. That's when he noticed his compass was pointing east. Robert stopped, frowning. He'd been maintaining a northeast heading, 45 degrees, but his compass now showed 90, due east. He must have gotten disoriented during the detours. He adjusted his course, pushing through a particularly dense stand of western hemlock. 10 minutes later, the compass showed southeast, 135 degrees. "That's not possible," Robert said aloud. His voice sounded flat in the moss-dampened air. He pulled out the GPS. Its heading matched the compass, 135 degrees. But his waypoint marker for Connor's last position showed he'd barely moved closer. In fact, according to the track log, his path over the last 10 minutes formed a curve, arcing southeast. Robert stopped walking. He stood perfectly still in the cathedral silence of the rainforest and performed a methodical check. GPS satellite lock showed 8 satellites, strong signal. Compass was level, bubble-centered, no obvious magnetic interference. He held up his smartphone, no signal, expected at this depth. But its internal compass matched the dedicated unit. All devices agreed. He was heading southeast, but that couldn't be right. He'd been course-correcting. He'd been paying attention, unless the forest itself had turned. Robert immediately dismissed the thought. Irrational, the kind of magical thinking that led to bad decisions in the wilderness. He pulled out his laptop, logged the anomaly, checked his topographic data. A small creek should be flowing northwest about 200 yards ahead. If he could find it, verify its direction, he could reorient. He found the creek in 5 minutes. It flowed southeast. According to the USGS maps he'd downloaded, this creek, Maple Creek, flowed northwest into the Hoh River. He'd verified the data himself, cross-referenced 3 sources. Water couldn't spontaneously reverse direction, couldn't flow uphill against gravity. Robert knelt beside the creek. Clear water, maybe 8 inches deep, flowing steadily over smooth stones. He set a leaf on the surface and watched it drift. Southeast. Definitely southeast. He pulled a tennis ball from his pack. He'd brought it for exactly this purpose, to test theories about terrain he couldn't trust his eyes to assess. He set it on the ground. It rolled. Southeast. "Magnetic anomaly," Robert muttered. "Has to be. Iron deposit. Electromagnetic field interfering with instruments." But he'd researched the Olympic geology. No significant iron deposits in the Hoh watershed, and magnetic anomalies didn't make water flow uphill. He checked his GPS again. Connor Burke's last known position was now almost a mile away. He'd been walking for 90 minutes and somehow gotten further from his destination. Robert stood fighting the flutter of panic in his chest. This was a navigation problem. Navigation problems had solutions. He just needed to think clearly. The canopy was too dense for visual triangulation, but he could climb. Get above the understory, spot a landmark, verify direction with his own eyes instead of trusting instruments that were obviously malfunctioning. He chose a massive Sitka spruce, its lower branches thick enough to support his weight. The climb took 20 minutes, bark rough under his hands, needles catching at his jacket. At 80 feet, he broke through the understory canopy into the secondary layer, still below the giant's crowns but high enough to see distance. The forest stretched in every direction, a rolling green sea. He could see the Hoh River Valley to the southwest, the higher peaks of the Blue Glacier region to the northeast, exactly where they should be. He pulled out binoculars, oriented himself. There, that ridge. He knew that ridge. It was south of Connor's position, which meant Connor's position was north, not northeast, not where his GPS said. Robert descended carefully, mind racing. Instrument malfunction was one thing, Complete failure across multiple independent systems was another. But the alternative, that space itself was somehow bent in this section of forest, was absurd. He reached the ground and checked his GPS one more time. The distance to Connor's waypoint had increased again. He'd now walked 3 miles and was 4/10 of a mile further away than when he started. "Okay," Robert said to the silent forest. "Okay. New approach." He would walk due north, verified by the ridge he'd spotted. Forget the instruments. Use dead reckoning and the landscape itself. He'd done land navigation training. He could maintain a bearing. He walked north. The forest resisted. Not obviously, not dramatically. Just constant, small interferences. A fallen log blocked his path, forcing a detour around. The detour led to a ravine too steep to cross, requiring another detour. That detour ended at an impassable wall of Devil's Club. Each obstacle pushed him slightly off course. Each correction seemed logical at the time. But after an hour, when Robert climbed another tree to check his position, he'd moved southeast. His radio crackled. "Fitzgerald, this is Base. Come in." Robert fumbled for the Motorola, grateful to hear another human voice. "Base, this is Fitzgerald. Go ahead." "What's your status? SAR team is assembling. We need your recon data." Robert looked at his GPS. He was now 1.2 miles from Connor Burke's last position, in the wrong direction. "Base, I'm experiencing navigation difficulties. Equipment may be compromised. Recommend delaying SAR deployment until I can verify grid coordinates." Silence. Then, "Define navigation difficulties. How did you explain this without sounding insane?" "Multiple independent systems showing inconsistent data. I'm unable to reach the designated coordinates." "Are you injured?" "Negative, just disoriented." Another pause. "Fitzgerald, abort and return to trailhead. SAR team will deploy without your recon. Follow your GPS track backwards." Robert pulled up his track log. The path he'd walked formed a spiral, curving inward, tightening, like water circling a drain. The visual made something cold settle in his stomach. "Copy that, Base. Returning now." He followed the track backwards. The GPS showed him walking in reverse along the exact path he'd taken, but the forest around him looked wrong. Trees he should have passed stood in different positions. The nurse logs he'd climbed over weren't there. After 30 minutes, his track log showed he'd returned to the point where he'd left the Hoh River Trail. But the trail wasn't there. Robert turned in a slow circle. Dense forest in every direction. No maintenance clearing. No trail signs. No worn path through the moss. He pulled up his waypoint for the trailhead. According to the GPS, he was standing on top of it. "Base, this is Fitzgerald. Static." "Base, do you copy?" More static, then pieces of a voice. "Zagerald, location." "Base, signal is breaking up. I am at the trailhead coordinates but cannot locate the trail. Request guidance." "East." The word came through clearly, then dissolved into white noise. "Southeast." Everything led southeast. Robert checked his compass. The needle spun lazily, making full rotations, never settling. He tapped it. The needle stopped, pointing directly at him, at his chest. He stepped sideways. The needle followed, staying locked on his position. "That's not how compasses work," Robert said to no one. He pulled out his smartphone. No signal, but the compass app was active. He opened it. The digital needle pointed at him too. Both compasses, mechanical and digital, ignoring magnetic north, tracking him instead. Something rustled in the understory. Large, moving with purpose. Robert's hand went to the bear spray, thumb on the safety. Black bears were common in the Hoh, but they avoided humans. This sounded bigger than a black bear, heavier. The rustling stopped. In the silence, Robert heard breathing. Not animal panting, human-like but wrong. Too slow. Each inhale lasting 10 seconds, each exhale 15. The rhythm was hypnotic, alien. "Hello?" Robert called. "Connor? Connor Burke?" The breathing stopped. Then, from multiple directions simultaneously, a voice. "Southeast." not Connor's voice. Robert had heard Connor's voice on the interview recordings from his emergency contact. This voice sounded like wind through tree branches, like creaking wood, like rustling leaves, but it formed the word clearly. Southeast. Robert's analytical mind tried to catalog it. Acoustic phenomenon, echo effect, auditory hallucination from stress. But 17 people had disappeared in this forest. 17 people whose last known positions clustered around trees that leaned southeast. He ran. No direction, no strategy, just primitive panic overriding 8 years of wilderness training. Branches whipped his face. Roots caught his feet. The massive pack threw off his balance. He crashed through Devil's Club, thorns shredding his jacket sleeves. The forest seemed to press closer, trees leaning inward, moss hanging lower, the canopy darkening from green to nearly black. Behind him, around him, the breathing continued, patient, unhurried. Robert burst into a small clearing and stopped, gasping. In the center stood a single tree unlike any he'd seen in the Pacific Northwest. Massive, ancient, its bark more like skin than wood, covered in moss that moved, actually moved, rippling in waves despite no wind. The tree leaned southeast at precisely 15 degrees. Around its base, 17 packs, 17 sets of camping gear, arranged in a perfect circle. Robert recognized Connor Burke's pack immediately, bright orange with the punk band patches Connor's girlfriend had mentioned in her statement. But the other packs showed varying degrees of decay, some recent nylon still vibrant, others older, fabric rotting, metal components rusted. The oldest looked decades old, canvas turned to tatters, all 17, every missing person. "No," Robert whispered. "No, this is southeast," the voice said, and this time Robert saw the source. The tree moved, not swaying, moving. The massive trunk split vertically, bark peeling back like lips, revealing a cavity that could not exist in living wood. Inside, darkness so complete it seemed solid. And eyes. Dozens of eyes. Owl eyes, unblinking, reflective, arranged in no pattern Robert's mind could process. A figure emerged from the tree, not born from it, not separate from it, but continuous with it. Humanoid in shape but covered entirely in moss, fungus, lichen. Where skin should be, Robert saw bark texture. Where hair should be, trailing strands of Spanish moss that didn't grow in the Pacific Northwest. The figure stood at least 8 feet tall, proportions wrong, limbs too long, joints bending in too many places. The owl eyes blinked in sequence, creating a wave of darkness across the thing's face. "You measure," it said in its wind voice. "You count. You map what is mine." Robert's legs stopped working. He collapsed to his knees, laptop tumbling from nerveless fingers. Every rational framework his mind had built, physics, geology, biology, shattered against what stood before him. This couldn't exist, couldn't be real. But his eyes insisted, his data insisted. The entity moved closer, each step silent despite its massive size. Moss trailed from its arms. Small mushrooms grew from its shoulders. A beetle crawled across where its face should be. "I am old," it said. "Before your trails. Before your names for my forest. I am Leshy. I am guardian. I am the forest itself." "That's..." Robert's voice cracked. "That's Slavic folklore. Eastern European. You don't belong here." The owl eyes blinked again, and Robert heard amusement in its voice. "I belong where forests grow, where my people remembered me, yes, where they forgot me also. Your Olympic came from my old world, trees, seeds, spores. They carried me across your ocean. I sleep in old growth. I wake when forest is threatened." Robert's analytical mind struggled for purchase. "The loggers, in the 1940s. You woke up when they started clear-cutting the Ho watershed." "You understand nothing," Leshy said. "I woke when they stopped. When your government made protection laws. When your kind decided this forest was yours to save." The entity leaned down, bringing those impossible eyes level with Robert's. The forest does not need your protection. The forest protects itself. Through me. Connor Burke wasn't a logger. None of those people were. They walked southeast, Leshy interrupted, into my heart, to the places I do not permit. Again and again your kind ignores the signs. The trees lean away, the water flows wrong, the compasses spin. Everything says, do not come here, but you come. You measure, you name, you make your maps and claim to understand. Robert's laptop screen still glowed on the ground, showing the southeast zone plotted in precise detail. His life's work reduced to meaningless data points. The 17 people, Robert managed. Where are they? Leshy straightened and the owl eyes looked past Robert into distances he couldn't perceive. Where all things go who enter the deep forest without respect. They became lost, truly lost, not in space, in themselves. The forest showed them what they were, creatures of concrete and metal, not moss and root. They could not accept it, could not adapt, so they stayed lost, forever searching for trails that exist only in their minds. That's murder. No, Leshy said simply. That is justice. This forest is not yours. These trees are not data. This land breathes, thinks, remembers, and I am its memory. The entity moved past Robert, approaching the circle of packs. It touched each one gently, almost reverently. 17 times I warned. 17 times I was ignored. Now you come with your machines that see everything and understand nothing. Robert's hand crept toward his radio. If he could transmit, if base could hear him, they'd send the SAR team. Helicopters. Armed rangers. You couldn't let this thing keep killing people, even if it claimed to be. A spirit, Leshy said, not turning. A guardian. An ancient consciousness woven into root and branch. Names you would understand are too small for what I am. Robert's fingers closed on the radio. Slowly, quietly, he brought it to his mouth. The forest exploded with sound. Not animal calls, not wind, something older. The creak of growing wood amplified 1,000 times, the rustle of 1,000,000 leaves, the deep groan of continental plates shifting. Robert's ears popped, his vision swam. The radio crumbled to rust in his hand. Just disintegrated, plastic and metal corroding in seconds, leaving red-brown dust coating his palm. You will not bring more, Leshy said. You will not map this place for others to find. You will not reduce mystery to coordinates. The entity turned and Robert saw something in those owl eyes that might have been sadness. I do not want to make you lost. You see patterns. You seek truth. In another age you might have been druid, shaman, one who speaks with forest. But your truth is numbers, cold, dead, and the forest is alive. Robert's mind raced. Negotiation, bargaining. There had to be a logical solution. What do you want? I'll delete the data. I'll tell them I found nothing. You will return, Leshy interrupted. With your eyes changed, you will tell them the forest is dangerous, that there are places humans should not go. Not because I forbid it, because the forest itself rejects your presence. The entity's moss-covered hand gestured to the circle of packs. You will tell them these 17 chose to disappear, walked away from their lives. Happens often in your world, yes? No mystery, no monster. Just wilderness being wilderness. They'll never believe that. Not with no bodies, no evidence. They will believe, Leshy said, because the alternative is madness. Easier to think 17 people chose to vanish than to accept that something ancient claims this ground. The owl eyes blinked in their unsettling wave. You have 1 hour of daylight to walk. Every direction but southeast will take you to your trail. Your instruments will work. Your compass will point north. The forest will release you. And if I tell them the truth? Robert asked, though he already knew. Then you join the circle, Leshy said simply, and someone else will come to map your disappearance. The pattern continues. Or, the entity moved closer again. The pattern ends. You choose. Robert's laptop still glowed. Years of data, correlations, maps, evidence. Everything he'd need to prove something was wrong in the southeast zone. But proof of what? That Slavic forest spirits had migrated to the Pacific Northwest? That ancient consciousness inhabited old-growth trees? That some things couldn't be measured or mapped? His hands shook as he reached for the laptop. Leshy watched, silent. Robert opened the file manager, selected the Southeast Zone folder. 17 disappearances. 9 years of analysis. His cursor hovered over delete. Data doesn't lie, Robert whispered. No, Leshy agreed. But data is not truth, just shadows of truth. And some truths are not meant to be captured. Robert deleted the folder, then the backups, then formatted the external hard drive. Each click felt like erasing part of himself. When the laptop screen went dark, Leshy nodded slowly. Go now. The forest opens for you. This time. Robert stood on shaking legs. The clearing no longer seemed to press inward. The canopy had lightened slightly. Behind him, visible now through gaps in the trees, he could see a path. Not a trail, just a way through. Southeast. I can't... Robert turned back. Those 17 people, Connor Burke, he has family. They deserve... The forest keeps what enters without respect, Leshy said. This is not cruelty. This is boundary. This is the old law your kind forgot when you built your cities and mapped your wilderness. The entity's voice softened slightly. Tell the families their loved ones found peace. It is not truth, but it is truer than what they imagine. Robert started walking. His GPS powered on, showing the trail just 200 yards northwest. His compass needle pointed steady north. Everything worked perfectly, responding exactly as it should. As if the last 6 hours had been fever dream. Except his radio was rust on the ground behind him. Except his data was gone. Except he knew with the certainty of someone who'd looked into owl eyes older than human language, that the forest was not just alive, but aware. He reached the Hoh River Trail as dusk settled, the familiar maintenance clearing, the trail markers, the distant sound of the river. Everything normal, everything safe. Base would be furious about his extended absence, worried about equipment failure, demanding explanations. Robert would tell them he got disoriented. Equipment malfunction. No sign of Connor Burke in the search area. Terrain too difficult for SAR operations. Weather moving in. Standard wilderness rescue situation with a negative outcome. They'd scale back the search, eventually classify Connor as missing, presumed deceased. Add him to the statistics. National parks were dangerous. People disappeared. Happened every year. No mystery, no monster. Just wilderness being wilderness. Robert walked back to the ranger station as stars appeared between the trees. His hands had stopped shaking. His mind had started processing, categorizing, filing the experience into boxes labeled, "Do not open." But one thought followed him through the darkening forest. The trees still leaned southeast. In a circle 8 miles in diameter, every Sitka spruce pointed away from something at the center. Something old. Something that remembered when forests covered the world and humans were rare creatures at the edges. Too small to map or measure or matter. The data had been right. Just incomplete. Because some patterns couldn't be captured by GPS and GIS. Some patterns existed in dimensions instruments couldn't detect. Robert had found the truth, and the truth had made him lie. He reached the ranger station at 9:47 p.m. Linda Morrison was waiting, relief and anger mixing on her face. "Fitzgerald, what the hell happened? We had SAR ready to go looking for you." "Equipment failure," Robert said. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. "Navigation instruments malfunctioned. I got disoriented in the southeast zone. Couldn't locate Connor Burke's last known position. Terrain is too dangerous for SAR deployment." Linda studied him. "You look like hell. You see something out there?" Robert thought of owl eyes blinking in sequence, of moss-covered limbs that moved with impossible grace, of 17 packs arranged in a perfect circle around a tree that was more than a tree. Just forest, he said, just the hoe being the hoe. Linda seemed to accept this. Get some sleep. We'll debrief in the morning. Scale back Connor Burke's search to trail-accessible areas only. Robert nodded and walked to his quarters. He didn't sleep. He sat at his desk, personal laptop open, and began deleting more files. His research into tree orientation patterns, his notes on disappearance clusters, his theories about the southeast zone, everything that might lead someone else to ask the questions he'd asked. Some patterns he now understood were warnings. The forest leaning away, water flowing wrong, compasses refusing to point true, not anomalies to be explained, but boundaries to be respected. By dawn, Robert Fitzgerald's career as a GIS analyst was effectively over. He couldn't map what he refused to acknowledge, couldn't analyze data he wouldn't collect. He submitted his resignation 2 weeks later, citing personal reasons. Linda Morrison tried to convince him to stay, but Robert was firm. He took a job with the Washington State Department of Transportation, mapping highways, urban planning, infrastructure projects, places where humans belonged and instruments told simple truths. He never returned to Olympic National Park, never hiked the Hoh River Trail again, never spoke about the 6 hours he'd spent in the southeast zone. But sometimes late at night he'd pull up satellite imagery of the forest, zoom in on the region where Connor Burke had disappeared. The trees still showed in high resolution, their canopy patterns visible from space. And if you looked closely, really closely, you could see them leaning. Thousands of trees, all pointing away from a center that couldn't be mapped, couldn't be measured, couldn't be reduced to data points and GPS coordinates. The forest kept its secrets, and Robert kept his. Because some truths he'd learned were too large to fit in human comprehension. Some places remained wild not because humans allowed it, but because wildness itself refused to be tamed. And sometimes the only way to honor mystery was to leave it unmapped, unmeasured, unknown. The southeast zone still existed. Connor Burke was still missing. 16 others before him remained lost. And the Leshy, if that's what it was, if names even applied, still guarded the deep forest where old growth remembered a time before humanity's cartographic arrogance. Robert Fitzgerald had found the pattern. He just couldn't tell anyone what it meant. The forest itself was the pattern, and the pattern was alive. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The tent was still standing, which was the first wrong thing. October storms in the Great Smoky Mountains didn't leave tents standing. They ripped them from stakes, sent them tumbling through the forest like tumbleweeds. But Megan Price's North Face 2-person shelter stood perfectly intact at the Laurel Falls backcountry campsite. Rainfly taut, vestibule zipped closed, as if she'd just stepped away for water. Robert Fitzgerald had found worse things in his 15 years as a ranger. He'd found bodies. He'd found suicide notes weighted down with stones. He'd found evidence of crimes that made the forest feel contaminated. But something about this abandoned camp made his hands shake as he approached, made the scar tissue on his left shoulder ache where Daniel's teeth had. He stopped that thought. 3 years since the incident at Cades Cove. 3 years of mandatory counseling, administrative review, reinstatement with conditions. 3 years of carrying Daniel's screams in his memory, the weight of the Glock in his hand, the impossible choice between mercy and protocol. The campsite was too clean. That was the second wrong thing. Megan Price had been missing for 36 hours. Her last radio check-in had come at 6:47 p.m. on October 15, 2008. Routine patrol, nothing unusual to report. Then silence. When she'd missed her morning check-in, dispatch had sent Robert to investigate. Standard procedure for solo rangers in the backcountry. But the camp showed no signs of struggle, no indication of rapid departure. Her backpack leaned against a tree, properly hung to keep critters out. Her Motorola radio sat beside the cold fire ring, turned off. Her sleeping bag was rolled neatly inside the tent. Everything organized, everything deliberate, everything wrong. Robert keyed his radio. "Base, this is Fitzgerald. I've located Price's campsite at Laurel Falls. Site appears abandoned but intact. No sign of the ranger." Static answered him, then Patricia's voice from the ranger station 12 miles away. "Copy, Fitzgerald. What's your assessment?" Robert looked around the campsite again. His Garmin GPS showed the coordinates exactly where Megan's itinerary had indicated she'd be. The elevation matched, 3,150 feet, in a saddle between two ridges thick with oak and hickory, showing their October colors. By all technical measures, this was exactly where she should have been. "Something's not right here, dispatch. Camp is too organized. Radio is present but powered off. No indication of emergency departure." "Do you need additional personnel?" Robert hesitated. The memory of Cade's Cove surfaced again, calling for backup, the team arriving to find him covered in Daniel's blood, the body already cooling, the impossible explanation he'd tried to give. The review board had been sympathetic but firm. Ranger Fitzgerald experienced an acute stress reaction, leading to lethal force against a colleague exhibiting symptoms of rabies or drug-induced psychosis. Justified under emergency protocols, but mandatory counseling and fitness for duty evaluation required. They'd never found what took Daniel. The lab results had shown nothing, no rabies, no drugs, no infection that could explain the transformation Robert had witnessed. His partner of 7 years changing over 3 days from a rational man to something that moved wrong, smelled wrong, spoke in a voice layered with harmonics that shouldn't come from a human throat. "Negative on additional personnel," Robert said. "I'll conduct a radius search and report back." He approached the tent, noting details with the careful attention trauma had taught him. No blood, no torn fabric. The zipper was closed from the outside, which meant Megan had exited the tent and secured it properly. Where had she gone? Inside the tent, her personal effects were arranged with military precision. Clothes folded, first aid kit sealed, Benchmade knife in its sheath, headlamp with fresh batteries, everything a ranger needed for backcountry work, all of it abandoned. Robert found her journal in the side pocket of her pack. The last entry was dated October 15th, written in Megan's neat handwriting. 6:30 p.m. Camp established at Laurel Falls site. Weather clear, temperature dropping faster than forecast. 38 degrees already. Strange sounds from the northeast. Not wildlife I recognize. Sounds almost like someone calling, but the tone is wrong. Makes me think of wind chimes made of bones. We'll investigate at first light if it continues. Robert felt ice crystallize in his stomach. He knew those sounds. He'd heard them 3 years ago, the night before Daniel started changing. He pulled out his own field journal, flipping back to October 2005. His handwriting from that time was messier, urgent. Day 1. Daniel complaining of hunger, won't eat rations, says everything tastes like ash, keeps staring at the tree line. Says he hears singing in Ojibwe, but neither of us speak Ojibwe. Robert closed both journals, his hands trembling. The October air felt colder than 38 degrees. It felt like the temperature was dropping inward, cold radiating from some point in the forest, spreading outward like infection. He began a systematic search of the perimeter, moving in expanding circles from the campsite. Standard search protocol. But his hand kept drifting to the Glock 22 on his hip, 40 caliber rounds that hadn't stopped Daniel until the 4th shot. Center mass, the way training dictated but friendship screamed against. 50 yards northeast of camp he found the first tracks. Bare footprints in the soft earth, human-sized but wrong. The toes were too long, the stride too wide. They pressed deep into the ground despite the dryness of the soil, as if whatever made them weighed far more than human proportions suggested. Robert photographed them with his digital camera, a Nikon Coolpix that the NPS had issued 6 months ago. The photos would look like evidence in a report, but Robert knew what he was really doing, creating a record in case he didn't come back, documentation for whoever found his body. The tracks led deeper into the forest, away from established trails. Robert marked his route with survey tape, tying orange ribbons to trees every 50 feet. The canopy thickened overhead, old-growth forest that had somehow survived the logging of the early 20th century. These trees had stood when the Cherokee walked these mountains, before the Trail of Tears, before the national park, before the idea that humans could own forest. The sound started a quarter-mile from camp, not wind chimes made of bones. That had been Megan's poetic description. Robert heard them more literally, clicking and scraping, rhythmic but not musical, like fingernails drumming on wood in a pattern that suggested language but conveyed no meaning human ears could parse. His radio crackled. Patricia's voice came through, distorted. "Fitzgerald, we're receiving interference on your channel. Are you experiencing equipment malfunction?" Robert checked the radio. Full battery, strong signal indicator. Negative, dispatch. Radio showing normal function on my end. Your transmission is breaking up. We're getting sounds that aren't voice. The clicking intensified. Robert realized with creeping horror that it was synchronized with his radio transmissions, as if something was intercepting the signal and adding its own sounds to the channel. "Base, I'm going radio silent until I complete the search. We'll report back in 1 hour." "Fitzgerald, that's not protocol. We need..." He turned off the radio. Protocol had failed Daniel. Protocol said rabies, said psychosis, said anything except what Robert had witnessed. His partner transforming into something that should not exist, something that the Ojibwe peoples had warned about for centuries before white settlers dismissed their stories as superstition. Wendigo. Daniel had whispered the word on the second day before speech became impossible, before his jaw distended and his teeth grew, and the hunger took everything human. Robert had researched it afterward during the suspension, during the counseling sessions where he'd learned to lie convincingly about what he'd seen. Wendigo, Algonquian traditions from the Great Lakes region, stories of humans who violated the ultimate taboo, who consumed human flesh and became something other, spirits of insatiable hunger that could possess humans, transforming them into monsters that could never be satisfied, never be stopped, never be saved. The stories said Wendigo brought cold, unnatural cold that persisted even in summer, ice forming on trees while the sun shone. They said Wendigo could mimic voices, luring victims with the sound of loved ones calling. They said Wendigo were never satisfied. The more they ate, the hungrier they became, a curse of eternal starvation written into transformed flesh. Robert had dismissed it as folklore, the anthropological curiosity of a displaced eastern woodlands tradition showing up in Cherokee territory. But the similarities to Daniel's transformation had been too precise, too specific. The sudden onset of hunger, the temperature drop, the voice changes, the physical alterations that medical science couldn't explain. The tracks led to a ravine, steep-sided and narrow, the kind of geological feature the Smokies specialized in. Ancient creek beds carved through metamorphic rock over millennia. October leaves had collected at the bottom, a carpet of red and gold that should have been beautiful but instead looked like scattered evidence. Robert descended carefully, using exposed roots as handholds. At the bottom, the cold intensified. He could see his breath now, white clouds in air that was well below freezing despite the calendar saying mid-October, despite the forecast calling for mild temperatures. He found the first body 20 feet into the ravine. Not Megan. The remains were too old, reduced mostly to bones and tatters of clothing, but the positioning made Robert's throat close. The skeleton lay curled in on itself, arms wrapped around the chest, legs drawn up, as if the person had died trying to contain something inside them, trying to hold themselves together against internal pressure. The bones showed teeth marks. Human teeth, Robert thought, though the gouges were too deep, the bite radius too wide. Something with human teeth but inhuman strength had gnawed at the corpse, consumed flesh and cracked bones to access marrow. His camera documented everything with clinical precision while his mind screamed warnings. He should leave. Call for backup despite what happened last time. Let someone else handle this, someone without his history, someone who could look at evidence without recognizing patterns that shouldn't exist. But Megan was out here, 26 years old, 2 years with the NPS, idealistic about wilderness protection and naive about what wilderness actually protected. She'd reminded Robert of himself at that age before Daniel, before he'd learned that forests were neutral territory where ancient things still held dominion. The second body was fresher. Days old, not years. The decay was wrong, though. Accelerated in some areas, completely absent in others, as if decomposition followed rules different from normal biological processes. The face was gone, consumed, but the ranger uniform was unmistakable. Megan Price. What remained of her? Robert knelt beside the body, professional training warring with nausea and grief. She'd been dead less than 24 hours based on rigor mortis patterns, which meant her last radio call had come when she was already... What? Already changing? Already lost? Her journal entry had been written at 6:30 p.m. Her last radio check was 6:47 p.m. 17 minutes between writing about strange sounds and making a routine transmission that revealed nothing. What had happened in those 17 minutes? Robert noticed her hands. The fingernails were gone, torn out or fallen off. The fingertips showed signs of rapid growth, calluses forming in hours that should take weeks, bone density increasing in ways that required months of adaptation. Her jaw looked dislocated, hanging at an angle that suggested the bone had been breaking and reforming, reshaping itself for a wider bite. She'd been transforming. Just like Daniel, the process had started but hadn't completed. Robert stood, scanning the ravine. The cold was intensifying, temperature dropping so fast he could feel ice crystals forming in his lungs. Somewhere in this geological wound, the source waited. The thing that had taken Daniel, the thing that had started taking Megan. He found it 30 yards further into the ravine, where the walls narrowed to barely 6 feet apart, and the autumn light died completely. It had been human once. Robert could see traces of that origin. The basic bipedal structure, the opposable thumbs, the skull shape that suggested mammalian ancestry. But the transformation had progressed far beyond what Daniel had reached, far beyond what Megan had started becoming. The thing was impossibly tall, 8 or 9 feet, but skeletal thin. Its skin had a gray-blue pallor, stretched tight over bones that jutted at wrong angles. The hands ended in fingers twice normal length, tipped with yellow nails like diseased claws. Its face was elongated, the lower jaw extended forward to accommodate teeth that filled the mouth in multiple rows, serrated and stained. But the worst part was the eyes. They held intelligence, recognition. The thing saw Robert and knew him, not as prey, but as witness, as someone who had already seen this before, already understood what stood before him. It spoke. The voice came from its throat but seemed to originate from multiple sources simultaneously, overlapping phonemes creating words in English layered over sounds in languages Robert didn't know, Ojibwe maybe, or Cree, or other Algonquian languages from territories where this thing's legend had been born. You remember me? It wasn't a question. The thing knew that Robert recognized it, understood what it was, what it did, what it represented. Daniel? Robert's voice cracked. Impossible. Daniel was dead. 4 shots, center mass, confirmed by the coroner. Buried in a cemetery in Knoxville with his family present, closed casket because of what Robert had done to stop him. Daniel was food. The thing's jaw moved wrongly as it spoke, the lower mandible dropping too far, revealing the meat-stained teeth. Daniel. Fed. The hunger. But the hunger never ends. Robert's hand moved to his Glock without conscious thought. The weapon cleared the holster, rose to eye level, sight picture perfect despite his shaking hands. 40 caliber rounds that had stopped Daniel. 40 caliber rounds that probably wouldn't stop this. The Wendigo didn't react to the gun. It watched Robert with eyes that showed something like pity, like recognition of futility. You cannot kill hunger, it said in that layered voice. Hunger is not alive. Hunger just is. Robert's finger tightened on the trigger. Training said shoot. Experience said run. But a deeper instinct, something primal that recognized when prey faced a predator beyond its capacity to fight, said freeze. The Wendigo moved. Not walking. Its locomotion defied description. The space between them collapsed, distance becoming irrelevant, and suddenly the thing was close enough that Robert could smell it. Rot and frost and something underneath, something chemical and wrong, like battery acid mixed with decaying meat. I was like you, it said. The voice held traces of different speakers. Daniel's tenor, other voices Robert didn't recognize. Dozens of people compressed into single words. I chose the forest. Chose hunger. Better than what waited outside. Robert's mind fractured trying to understand. This thing had been human, had chosen transformation, had violated the taboo willingly, consumed human flesh to become something that could never be human again. Why? The word came out as a whisper. The Wendigo's jaw opened wider, impossibly wide, showing throat that descended into darkness deeper than anatomy allowed. Because hunger is eternal, but the hunted are temporary. It meant to take him. Robert understood with perfect clarity. The thing would consume him, add his voice to the chorus it carried, make him part of the hunger that could never be satisfied. His training took over. Robert fired, once, twice, 3 times center mass, the Glock bucking in his hands with familiar recoil. The reports echoed off the ravine walls, deafening in the confined space. The bullets hit. Robert saw impact, saw tissue deform. But the Wendigo didn't fall. It didn't even stagger. The wounds closed as he watched, tissue knitting together faster than damage could accumulate, flesh repairing itself through some mechanism that made biology irrelevant. You cannot kill what has already died, the Wendigo said, its mouth returning to a shape approximately human. Robert ran. He scrambled up the ravine wall, fingers tearing on rock and root, knees slamming against stone. Behind him, the clicking sound intensified. Not pursuit, but something worse. Something like laughter expressed through language human throats couldn't produce. The Wendigo wasn't chasing him. It didn't need to. Robert could feel the cold following, temperature dropping so fast that ice formed on the trees he passed. The hunger was spreading, claiming territory, establishing dominion. He reached the top of the ravine and kept running, abandoning the survey tape, abandoning protocol, abandoning everything except the desperate need to escape. His lungs burned with cold air. His legs screamed with exhaustion. But terror drove him forward, the same terror that had driven humans into caves millennia ago. The recognition that some things killed not for food or territory, but because killing was their essential nature. Robert burst into Megan's campsite, grabbed her radio, keyed the transmit button. Base, this is Fitzgerald, emergency at Laurel Falls. Officer down, I repeat, officer down, static answered. Then Patricia's voice, distant and distorted. Fitzgerald, your transmission. Unclear. Please, repeat. Emergency, send everyone. Megan Price is dead. There's something in the forest. It killed her. It killed Daniel. It's still here. Fitzgerald, you're not making sense. Are you injured? Do you need medical evac? The cold reached the campsite. Robert watched frost spread across Megan's tent in seconds, ice crystals forming patterns that looked almost like writing, almost like warnings in a language older than English, older than Cherokee, old as the mountains themselves. Run, Robert whispered into the radio. Everyone needs to run. But even as he said it, he knew running wouldn't help. The hunger didn't chase. It waited. It let its prey come to it, drawn by curiosity or duty or the belief that humans could solve every problem with enough tools and courage. The clicking sound grew louder. Robert turned to face it, knowing he should run, knowing survival meant abandoning the campsite and everything in it, but unable to move. The Wendigo emerged from the tree line, moving with that impossible locomotion that made distance meaningless. But it wasn't alone. Behind it came others. Smaller, less transformed, still showing traces of their human origins. One wore the tattered remains of a ranger uniform, probably the skeleton he'd found in the ravine. Another looked fresh, transformation just beginning. Skin still mostly human, but eyes already showing the flat hunger that erased personality. They were making more. The Wendigo didn't just kill, it transformed, added to its pack, built a hierarchy of hunger that spread through the forest like infection through blood. Robert raised his Glock again. Useless against the lead creature, but maybe the others were still vulnerable, still close enough to human that bullets would matter. He fired at the nearest transformed human, 3 shots to the chest. It fell. Actually fell. The body hit the ground and stopped moving, staying down. The Wendigo tilted its head, that gesture almost human, almost curious. Then it spoke in a voice that was purely Daniel's, his partner's familiar tenor. "Robert, I'm sorry you have to see this, but you know there's only one way this ends." Robert's hands shook. Hearing Daniel's voice from that impossible mouth broke something inside him, shattered the careful compartmentalization he'd built during 3 years of therapy. "You're not Daniel," Robert said. "Part of me is. Part of me is everyone it's ever consumed. We're all still here, Robert. Still aware. Still hungry." The voice shifted, became Megan's. "It hurts so much. The hunger never stops. Please make it stop." Robert couldn't shoot. The weapon felt impossibly heavy. He'd killed Daniel once. He couldn't do it again, even knowing that what stood before him was just wearing Daniel's voice like stolen clothes. The Wendigo moved closer. The transformed humans circled the campsite, cutting off escape routes. The cold had become absolute, October vanishing into something that felt like deepest winter. "You have a choice," the thing said in a voice that combined all the speakers it had consumed. "Run and die slow. We'll find you. We always find them. Or accept transformation. Join us. The hunger is terrible, but it's better than the alternative." What alternative? The Wendigo's jaw dropped into that impossible gape, revealing the darkness inside. Being the hungry. Robert understood then. The thing wasn't just describing its condition, it was offering an escape. Become the predator instead of the prey. Join the hierarchy of consumption. Let the hunger erase everything that made him Robert Fitzgerald, every memory that caused pain, every choice that haunted him. It would be easier. So much easier than carrying Daniel's death, carrying the knowledge of what existed in the forest, carrying the weight of being a witness to things his training said were impossible. His finger relaxed on the trigger. Then his radio crackled. Patricia's voice came through clearly for the first time. "Fitzgerald, we have a helicopter en route to your position. ETA 15 minutes. Can you maintain position?" The sound of a human voice, normal and concerned and ignorant of horror, snapped something back into place. Robert keyed the radio. "Negative. Falling back to Trail Junction Beta. We'll meet evac there." He didn't wait for response. He ran, firing behind him as he moved, not aiming, just creating chaos, buying seconds. The transformed humans scattered, vulnerable to bullets even if the original Wendigo wasn't. The forest transformed around him as he ran. Trees that should have been a quarter-mile apart stood inches from each other. Trails that he'd walked 1,000 times looped back on themselves. The cold created a labyrinth, space folding according to rules written by hunger rather than geology. But Robert had spent 15 years learning these mountains. He knew them before the Wendigo, knew them through seasons and storms, knew them with an intimacy born of love rather than consumption. He navigated by feel, by instinct, by a connection to the forest that predated the hunger's claim. Trail Junction Beta materialized ahead, the intersection where backcountry trails met maintained paths, where civilization's grip on wilderness grew stronger. Robert burst onto the cleared trail and kept running, hearing the helicopter now, the mechanical rhythm of rotors cutting through the clicking that followed him. The Wendigo didn't cross the junction. Robert realized with creeping understanding that it couldn't. Not that trail junctions created some magical barrier, but that the thing's relationship with space only worked in deep forest, in places where human influence hadn't imposed its grid of trails and markers and meaning. The helicopter landed in a clearing 200 yards down the maintained trail. Rangers emerged, weapons drawn, shouting questions Robert couldn't process over the rotor noise. They grabbed him, pulled him toward the aircraft, professional hands checking for injuries. Robert looked back at the forest edge. The Wendigo stood just beyond the tree line, watching. As the helicopter lifted off, banking toward the ranger station, Robert saw more transformed shapes emerging from the woods. A dozen at least, maybe more. A whole pack of hunger waiting in the deep places. The aerial view showed the Smokies in full October glory. Hundreds of thousands of acres of forest blazing with autumn colors. Beautiful and deadly and home to something older than human presence. Something that had learned to use the forest's vast spaces as hunting ground and transformation chamber. At the ranger station, they took his weapon, took his statement, took his blood for drug testing. The interview was gentle but thorough. They'd found Megan's body. They'd found the other remains in the ravine. They wanted to understand what had happened. Robert told them about discovering the camp, following tracks, finding the bodies. He described a wild animal attack, possibly a bear, though the wounds didn't match any known species. He said the cold had disoriented him, made him panic, made him imagine things that couldn't exist. The investigators were sympathetic. They'd read his file, knew about Daniel, understood he was traumatized. They recommended medical leave, more counseling, evaluation before return to duty. Robert agreed to everything. He signed forms and gave up his badge and accepted the prescription for anxiety medication. He cooperated completely while knowing that nothing he'd agreed to would matter, because the hunger was in the forest, and the forest was vast and people would keep coming, keep hiking into deep places where trails ended and distance became negotiable. 3 days later, they found another ranger missing from a backcountry post. The GPS showed her last position at a campsite near Klingman's Dome. The satellite photos revealed her tent standing perfectly intact, abandoned, everything organized and nothing disturbed. Robert was in mandatory medical leave, but he heard the reports. He heard the search teams being organized, the protocols being followed, the assumption that this was routine, that wilderness claimed hikers sometimes, but wilderness followed understandable rules. He wanted to warn them. Wanted to explain what waited in the deep forest, what the October cold signified, what the clicking sounds meant. But language failed. How could he explain that the mountains housed hunger given form, that transformation was a choice some made and others had forced upon them, that bullets could kill the transformed but not the transformation itself? Robert filed his report from home, adding details about temperature anomalies and unusual animal behavior. He included recommendations for cold weather protocol even in moderate seasons. He suggested that certain areas be closed to backcountry camping until further study could be completed. The recommendations were filed and forgotten. The Great Smoky Mountains received over 9 million visitors per year. A few disappearances were statistically inevitable. The Park Service operated on probabilities and resources and political realities, not on the testimony of a traumatized ranger who'd shot his partner and now claimed monsters haunted the backcountry. In November, Robert received his medical discharge from the National Park Service. The paperwork cited post-traumatic stress disorder, inability to perform essential functions of the position, recommendation for continued mental health treatment. He didn't contest it. He packed his apartment in Gatlinburg and drove north, away from the Smokies, away from forest entirely. He took a job in Cincinnati working corporate security, checking badges and monitoring cameras, a position that required no weapon and no decisions more complex than whether to call the police. But he still had the photographs, the tracks in the forest floor, the bodies in the ravine, the shape at the tree line watching as the helicopter lifted off. Digital images that showed what human eyes shouldn't see, evidence of things that scientific paradigms had no framework to accommodate. Robert kept them encrypted, password protected, backed up to servers he paid for with cash. Documentation of the moment his understanding of reality had shattered twice. Once when Daniel transformed, once when he'd understood that Daniel wasn't alone, that the forest housed colonies of hunger, packs of transformed humans who'd chosen or been forced into becoming something beyond human. On cold nights, which came often in Cincinnati winters, Robert would pull up the images and study them. The Wendigo's face, human and not human, showing traces of everyone it had consumed. The transformed rangers still wearing their uniforms as they hunted. The ice patterns on Megan's tent that looked like warnings in a language nobody spoke anymore. He thought about her last journal entry. Sounds almost like someone calling, but the tone is wrong. She'd heard it and investigated. She'd been drawn by curiosity and duty toward the thing that would transform her, make her part of the hungry pack that waited in the deep forests. Robert wondered how many others existed now. The Wendigo had shown him a dozen transformed humans, but how many others waited in the vast acres of the Smokies? And were they confined to the Smokies, or did similar packs exist in other wilderness areas, other national forests, other places where humans disappeared into deep spaces and became statistics rather than mysteries? The folklore suggested Wendigo originated in the Great Lakes region, in Ojibwe and Cree territories far north of Cherokee land, but Daniel had transformed in the Smokies. The original Wendigo had claimed it chose the forest. What had driven it south? What made it establish territory in Appalachia? Robert had no answers, only questions and photographs and the memory of his partner's voice coming from a mouth that shouldn't speak, offering transformation as mercy, promising that hunger was better than being hunted. Sometimes he considered sending the files to someone, a researcher, an investigator, someone who might understand, but who would believe, and what good would belief do? The forest was vast, the hungry were patient, and humans would keep coming, keep hiking into deep places, keep following the sounds that called with tones that were almost right but fundamentally wrong. In spring, Robert's phone rang. Unlisted number. He almost didn't answer. Robert Fitzgerald? The voice was official, clipped, federal. Yes. This is Special Agent Matthews, FBI. I'm part of a task force investigating unusual disappearances in national park areas. Your name came up in our research. I'd like to discuss the incidents at Great Smoky Mountains in 2005 and 2008. Robert's hand tightened on the phone. I gave my statements to the investigators. I've read your official statements. I'm more interested in what you didn't say. The details that didn't make it into the reports, the things you thought no one would believe. Robert closed his eyes. Someone was investigating. Someone had noticed the patterns. Whether that was hope or horror, he couldn't decide. What makes you think there's anything I didn't say? Because 17 rangers have disappeared from backcountry posts across 7 national parks in the last decade, all in October. All during temperature drops that weather data can't explain. All with last known positions at campsites found intact and abandoned. A pause. And all the survivors who encountered something in the forest tell the same story officially. Animal attack, disorientation, stress reaction. But their eyes tell a different story. They've seen something. Something they can't explain and don't want to remember. Robert sat in silence, considering. If he spoke, if he shared the photographs and what he knew, he would be marked forever as the ranger who believed in monsters. But if he didn't speak, how many more Megans would follow sounds into the forest? How many more Daniels would choose transformation over the alternative? If I share information, Robert said slowly, what happens? We investigate, quietly. No media, no public panic. Just a small team gathering evidence, documenting patterns, developing protocols. And if the evidence shows something outside normal parameters, something that doesn't fit scientific explanation? Agent Matthews was quiet for a moment. Then, Mr. Fitzgerald, I have files on my desk that describe attacks by things that leave no physical trace, disappearances that violate known physics, phenomena that make experienced law enforcement officers refuse to return to certain locations. I stopped worrying about scientific paradigms 6 months into this assignment. I just want to understand what's killing people and how to stop it. Robert thought of Daniel's last words before transformation took his speech. It's not killing me. It's making me more. He thought of the Wendigo's offer. Join us. The hunger is terrible, but it's better than the alternative. He thought of Megan writing about sounds like bone wind chimes and investigating instead of running. I'll send you files, Robert said. Photographs, location data, my observations. Everything I documented. But you need to understand what's in those files won't give you easy answers. It won't suggest clean solutions. Some of what I saw I still don't believe, even though I witnessed it. I'm used to complicated, Matthew said. Send what you have, we'll work with it. After the call ended, Robert sat with his laptop, the encrypted files open, his finger hovering over the send button. Once he transmitted this information, he would become officially the ranger who claimed monsters were real. His discharge would be vindicated. His testimony would be questioned. But maybe, possibly, someone would take action before the next October, before the next cold descended, before the next ranger followed strange sounds into the deep forest. Robert attached the files and typed a brief explanation. Then he hit send and watched the progress bar slowly transmit his evidence into the federal system. Documentation of hunger and transformation and choices that removed humanity, one bite at a time. Outside his Cincinnati apartment, spring rain fell in ordinary patterns. Traffic passed with normal rhythms. The world operated according to comprehensible rules. But Robert knew that in the Smoky Mountains, October would come again. The temperature would drop. The clicking sounds would echo through the deep forest. And something that had been human would wait for the next hiker, the next ranger, the next person who heard strange tones and chose investigation over retreat. The hunger never ended. Robert understood that now. It was patient and old and perfectly adapted to the vast wilderness areas humans had preserved, ironically creating protected hunting grounds for things that hunted humans. All he could do was document, warn, and hope that someone would listen before curiosity led them past the tree line, into the cold, toward sounds like bone wind chimes calling in the deep places where hunger waited, eternal and insatiable. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The footprints ended at nothing. Amanda Castellano crouched in the sand, studying the tracks that had led her 3 miles into the Panamint Valley. Boot prints, size 11 or 12, deep enough to suggest a man carrying significant weight. The stride pattern indicated someone moving at a normal walking pace, not running, not stumbling. The prints were clear and recent, made within the last 12 hours before the wind could erase them. And then they simply stopped existing. Not faded, not obscured by wind or rock. The left footprint was clear and complete, pressed into the sand with perfect definition. Where the right foot should have landed, 18 inches ahead and slightly to the right, there was only undisturbed sand rippled by yesterday's wind. It looked as if Nathan Drake had taken one step and been plucked from the earth mid-stride. Amanda sat back on her heels, feeling the July sun hammer against her neck despite the bandana and wide-brimmed hat. The temperature was already pushing 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was only 10 in the morning. She'd started tracking at dawn from Nathan's abandoned campsite, following his trail with the kind of focus that kept her from thinking about why she was alone out here, why she'd volunteered for this search when she could have stayed at the ranger station and let someone else handle it. 2 years ago, her partner Miguel had disappeared in the Mojave. They'd found his body 3 days later, partially buried by a flash flood in a wash that shouldn't have had water in it. The official cause of death was drowning, but Amanda still dreamed about the expression frozen on his face. Not the peaceful mask of someone who'd lost consciousness, but the wide-eyed terror of someone who'd seen something impossible in his final moments. She'd taken a year off after that. Therapy, medication, long stretches of time where she couldn't bring herself to look at a topographic map. When she'd finally returned to work at Death Valley, the superintendent had been understanding, had kept her on light duty, had never asked why she sometimes had to walk away from radio calls about missing hikers. But when Nathan Drake's sister had called yesterday, voice breaking as she described her brother's planned solo backpacking trip through the Panamint Range. Amanda had felt something click into place. Nathan was 31, experienced, carrying a Garmin InReach satellite communicator that showed his last position at 36.2574 N, 117,0891 W, coordinates that placed him in an area of the valley Amanda knew well. He'd missed his scheduled check-in 12 hours ago. His emergency beacon hadn't been activated. Amanda had told the superintendent she'd do a preliminary search, just a quick sweep of the likely routes. She'd told herself it was professional duty, that any ranger would do the same. She hadn't admitted that she needed to know, needed to see what had happened, needed to confirm that not every disappearance in the desert ended with a body and unanswered questions. Now she was staring at footprints that defied logic, and the old fear was back, settling in her chest like a stone. Amanda pulled out her Nikon D200 and photographed the tracks from multiple angles, including a shot with her GPS unit in frame, showing the coordinates. Then she stood and walked a slow circle around the area, searching for any indication of where Nathan might have gone. Scuff marks, drag marks, signs of a struggle, anything. The sand was pristine except for her own tracks and the impossible line of prints that terminated at nothing. She keyed her Motorola radio. Castellano to base, over. Static then. Go ahead, Amanda. I'm at Nathan Drake's last known position. I've got tracks leading away from his campsite, but they're anomalous. Requesting a second unit for verification. Over. A pause. Define anomalous. Amanda looked at the footprints again, at the precise point where they stopped. How did you explain this without sounding unhinged? The track pattern is inconsistent with normal travel. I need another set of eyes. Over. Copy that. Sanders is en route from Furnace Creek, ETA 90 minutes. Do you need immediate support? Over. Negative. I'm going to continue the search pattern. Castellano out. She clipped the radio back to her belt and started walking a grid search around the termination point, moving in expanding circles. The sun was merciless, turning the air into something that felt solid, heavy. Sweat evaporated from her skin before it could bead, leaving salt deposits that itched and burned. Amanda's camelback was already down a liter, and she'd need to turn back within 2 hours if she didn't find anything. At 20 yards from the footprints, she found the first sign that something was deeply wrong. Someone had arranged rocks in a pattern on the sand, small stones, maybe 50 of them, forming a design that made her eyes hurt to follow. It looked vaguely like a star with too many points, or perhaps a flower with petals that curved back on themselves. The rocks were dark basalt, deliberately chosen to contrast with the pale sand, and in the center of the pattern, written in what looked like charcoal or ash, was text in a script Amanda didn't recognize. The letters were flowing and elegant, with dots and diacritical marks that suggested Arabic, though Amanda's limited exposure to the language made her uncertain. What she could say with confidence was that someone had spent considerable time creating this symbol, and that it had been made recently, probably within the last 24 hours, given the lack of wind disturbance. Amanda photographed the symbol, zooming in on the text. Then she carefully stepped around it and continued her search. At 40 yards, she found another symbol. Different design, same dark rocks, more text in the same script. This one looked almost like a hand with 7 fingers, the palm filled with additional characters. At 60 yards, a third symbol, a square within a circle within a triangle, mathematical in its precision. Amanda marked each location in her GPS, then pulled up the saved waypoints on the display. The 3 symbols formed a perfect equilateral triangle, with the termination point of Nathan's footprints at the exact center. Her hands were shaking. Amanda recognized the tremor from 2 years ago, from the days after they'd found Miguel, when she couldn't hold a coffee cup without spilling. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to focus on the concrete facts. Someone had created these symbols. Nathan had walked to this spot. The symbols and his disappearance were connected, but that connection didn't have to be supernatural. This could be evidence of foul play, of kidnapping, of Nathan encountering someone dangerous who'd staged an elaborate scene to confuse searchers. That explanation felt thin even as she constructed it. Amanda returned to Nathan's campsite, which she'd marked with orange surveyor's tape. He'd pitched a mountain hardware tent in the shadow of a rock formation, choosing a spot that would provide shade during the afternoon heat. The tent was properly staked, no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Inside, she found his sleeping bag neatly rolled, a paperback novel marked halfway through, a water bottle 3/4 full. His backpack was there too, which made no sense. No experienced hiker walked away from their pack in Death Valley. The pack contained everything necessary for survival: water filtration, food, first aid, emergency blanket. Nathan's wallet was in the top pocket, along with his car keys and phone. The phone had no signal, which was normal for this area, but the battery was at 68%. Amanda went through the pack methodically, documenting each item, standard gear, all of it. Nothing unusual until she reached the bottom compartment, where she found something wrapped in a cloth that felt like silk. The book was old. Not antique dealer old, but genuinely ancient, the kind of old that made Amanda's breath catch. The binding was leather, cracked and stained, held together with what looked like copper wire. The pages were some kind of parchment or vellum, thick and irregular, and the text was in the same flowing script she'd seen in the rock symbols. Amanda carefully opened the cover. The first page contained an illustration rendered in faded ink, a humanoid figure wreathed in flames, its features simultaneously human and utterly alien. The eyes were too large, the mouth too wide, the proportions subtly wrong in ways that made her want to look away. Beneath the illustration, more text in that incomprehensible script. She flipped through the pages slowly. More illustrations, geometric patterns, star charts that didn't match any astronomy she knew, diagrams of circles and triangles filled with text. One page showed what looked like a brazier with smoke rising from it, the smoke resolving into shapes, animals, faces, abstract forms. Another page depicted a desert landscape with a figure standing at the center of multiple circles drawn in the sand, arms raised, fire surrounding them on all sides. The final pages contained what looked like instructions, step-by-step diagrams showing the creation of symbols, the arrangement of stones, the placement of offerings, and in the margins, someone had added notes in English. Nathan's handwriting. Amanda recognized it from his registration form. Day 1. Found the book in a cave off Wild Rose Canyon. Can't believe this was just sitting there. Arabic is rusty, but I think this is a grimoire, medieval Islamic magic text. Possibly related to jinn invocation. Need to research when I get back. Day 2. Symbols are protective circles. The text describes summoning rituals for fire spirits, Ifrit-class jinn. Writer warns against attempting without proper preparation. Obviously not planning to try it, but fascinating from anthropological perspective. Day 3. Having weird dreams, fire everywhere. A voice speaking a language I don't know but somehow understand. Woke up with sand in my mouth even though tent was sealed. Day 4. The voice is getting clearer. It's asking me to complete the ritual. Says it's been waiting for someone to read the words, to speak them aloud. I know this is just heat exhaustion or dehydration affecting my judgment, but part of me wants to try. Just to see. Just to know if it's real. The notes ended there. Amanda checked the date on Nathan's last entry. Yesterday morning, which meant by yesterday afternoon, he'd walked out into the desert, created 3 geometric symbols in a perfect triangle, and then vanished from the center point. He'd attempted the ritual. Amanda closed the book and wrapped it back in the silk cloth, her mind racing. This was evidence, but evidence of what? That Nathan had experienced some kind of psychological break and wandered off in a delusional state? That was the rational explanation, the one she should report to the superintendent. But rational explanations didn't account for footprints that ended at nothing. They didn't explain the precision of the rock symbols, or the fact that Nathan had left his water, his pack, everything necessary for survival. And they certainly didn't explain the sudden spike of heat Amanda felt as she held the wrapped book. Heat that seemed to radiate from the pages themselves, warm enough to make her fingers tingle. She set the book down and pulled out her water bottle, drinking half of it in long gulps. The heat was getting to her. She was projecting her own trauma onto this situation, seeing significance where there was only coincidence. Nathan had walked somewhere. She'd find him dehydrated and confused, and they'd extract him, and this would become another story about someone who underestimated the desert. Amanda's radio crackled. Not Sanders calling in. This was something else. A voice, distant and distorted by static, speaking words she couldn't quite make out. The language sounded guttural, harsh, nothing like English or Spanish or any of the indigenous languages she'd encountered working in the Southwest. "Sanders, is that you? You're breaking up. Repeat last message. Over." The voice continued, ignoring her. Or perhaps not ignoring, perhaps responding, but in a language that predated modern communication protocols. The words rose and fell in a pattern that felt like poetry or prayer, rhythmic and deliberate. Then cutting through the static, a single word in English. Castellano. Her name, pronounced with an accent that wasn't quite right. The syllables stretched and emphasized strangely. "Who is this? Identify yourself. Over." Laughter, low and crackling like fire consuming dry wood. "You hold my prison. You carry the words that bound me. Will you speak them, Ranger? Will you finish what your Nathan Drake began?" Amanda dropped the radio. It hit the sand and continued transmitting, the voice pouring out of the speaker. "He called but did not complete the ritual. He created the circles but did not enter them. He spoke 3 of the 7 names but fell silent before the binding could take hold. So I took him halfway. He is neither here nor there, neither flesh nor flame. Suspended. Waiting." She grabbed the radio and switched it off. The voice cut mid-sentence. Amanda stood there breathing hard, staring at the device in her hand. Hallucination. Had to be. Heat exhaustion caused auditory hallucinations. She'd been out in 115-degree heat for hours, probably dehydrated despite her water intake. The rational response was to return to her vehicle, rehydrate, cool down, and request backup before continuing the search. But Miguel's face flashed in her memory, that expression of final terror, the one that had haunted her for 2 years. And now Nathan was out here, suspended between here and there, according to a voice that shouldn't exist, and Amanda was holding a book that radiated impossible heat. She picked up the grimoire again, unwrapping it from the silk. The text was incomprehensible, but the illustrations were clear enough. A ritual of invocation, requiring 3 symbols arranged in a triangle, an incantation spoken at the center point, offerings of water and salt, and something the diagram suggested was blood. Nathan had created the symbols. He'd started the incantation. 3 of 7 names, the voice had said. And then something had happened. Something that plucked him from reality mid-stride and left his footprints terminating at nothing. Amanda could call this in. She could package up the evidence, mark the coordinates, and let someone else deal with the impossibility of it. That would be the sane choice, the safe choice, the choice that kept her from confronting the same unknowable horror that had killed Miguel. Or she could finish the ritual. The thought came unbidden, and Amanda recognized its source immediately. Not rationality, but desperation. The same desperation that had driven her into the desert alone, that had made her volunteer for this search despite her trauma. She needed to know. She needed to understand what happened to people who vanished in the desert, and this book, with its elaborate instructions and dire warnings, offered a way to find out. She looked at the symbols drawn in Nathan's notes, at the phonetic transcriptions he'd made of the Arabic words. He'd done half the translation work already, had identified the names that needed to be spoken. The 7th name was partially visible in his notes. Zabania, the Guardians of Fire. Amanda sat in the shadow of Nathan's tent and read through his notes 3 more times, committing the pronunciation guides to memory. Then she stood, tucked the grimoire under her arm, and walked back to the center point where the footprints ended. The 3 stone symbols surrounded her, forming a triangle approximately 60 feet on each side. Standing at the center felt like standing in a spotlight, despite the shadows being wrong for that. The sun was high and brutal, creating only small shadows directly beneath objects. But Amanda felt exposed, watched, as if the desert itself had focused its attention on this small patch of sand. She set the grimoire on the ground and opened it to the page with the incantation. The words were foreign, angular, but Nathan's phonetic guide was clear enough. Amanda had minored in linguistics at university, had studied pronunciation systems and phoneme classification. She could make the sounds. The question was whether she should. "Miguel," she said aloud, speaking to the memory that had driven her here, "I need to know. I need to understand what happened to you. If there's something out here that takes people, that leaves them with that expression on their face, I need to see it. I need to stop being afraid." The desert offered no response. Wind moved across the sand, erasing her footprints, indifferent to human need. Amanda began to read. The first name came out awkwardly, her tongue stumbling over consonants that didn't exist in English. Ifrit, the word for the fire jinn, the malevolent spirits that lived in flames and punished those who disturbed them. The second name was harder. Samum, the poison wind, the simoom that killed travelers in the desert. Third, Zabania, the guardians who tortured the damned. Fourth, Malik, the angel of hell. With each name, the air grew heavier, the heat intensified, going from brutal to supernatural, as if the sun had decided to focus its entire output on this single point. Amanda's skin prickled with sweat that evaporated instantly. Her throat felt scorched. Fifth name, Iblis, the devil himself in Islamic tradition, the jinn who refused to bow to Adam. Sixth, Nar, fire, pure and simple. The temperature had become unbearable. Amanda's vision swam. She could smell smoke, could see heat shimmer rising from the sand in waves that distorted reality. The stone symbols surrounding her had begun to glow faintly, as if heated from within. Seventh name, the final word. Nathan had made it this far and stopped, the voice had said. 3 of 7. But Amanda had spoken 6, and the 7th was right there in the phonetic guide, waiting. She read, Jahim. Hellfire. The desert exploded into flame, not literal fire. Amanda's rational mind insisted on that even as she felt her skin blister. The flames were visible, roaring up from the sand in columns 30 feet high, but they didn't consume. They surrounded her on all sides, forming a wall that trapped her at the center of the triangle. Through the fire, she could see the desert landscape wavering like a mirage, and then the landscape changed. The Panamint Valley disappeared. In its place, Amanda saw a desert of black sand beneath a sky the color of molten copper. 3 suns hung in that sky, each a different size, their light casting overlapping shadows that made distance impossible to judge. The temperature was beyond measurement, hot enough that Amanda should have been dead, should have been ash. But she remained standing, breathing air that tasted like cinnamon and sulfur. You completed the summoning. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in her bones. The first to do so in 700 years. The flames before her coalesced into a shape, humanoid but wrong, its proportions stretched and twisted. The figure was perhaps 12 feet tall, composed entirely of fire that held a semi-solid form. Its face was a suggestion of features rendered in flame, eyes that burned with intelligence and malice. I am Soraka, it said, Ifrit of the empty places. Your Nathan Drake called to me but lacked the courage to finish. So I left him suspended in the space between summons. Not quite called, not quite released. A punishment for wasting my time. Amanda's voice came out as a rasp. Where is he? Between. The djinn gestured, and the flames parted briefly. Through the gap, Amanda saw Nathan Drake frozen in mid-stride, his body translucent like glass, his face locked in an expression of terror. He wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, existed in some state that was neither alive nor dead. Release him, Amanda demanded, trying to sound commanding despite her fear. Soraka laughed, and the sound was like a wildfire consuming a forest. You have no power to command me, little ranger. You spoke the names, yes, but you made no offerings. You prepared no bindings. You stand in my circles with no protection, no copper wire to trap me, no Solomon's seal to compel obedience. You are prey that has thrown itself into the predator's mouth. The truth of that settled on Amanda like a weight. She'd read the incantation without reading the protections. She'd called the jinn but had no way to control it. In her desperation to understand, to confront the horror that had taken Miguel and now Nathan, she'd made the classic mistake. She'd opened a door without preparing to close it. "What do you want?" she asked. "Freedom." The jinn moved closer, the heat of it making Amanda's hair smoke. "I was bound by a desert sorcerer 7 centuries ago, trapped in this grimoire with instructions that would call me forth. But the binding was clever. I could only be fully released if someone completed the ritual of 7 names and then voluntarily ceded their form to me. Your Nathan understood that, which is why he stopped. But you, grieving one, you might be desperate enough to trade. Trade what? Your body, your life in the physical world. You would cease to exist and I would take your form, walking free in the world of sand and water and human flesh. And in exchange I would release your Nathan Drake from his suspension. 1 life for 1 life. A fair bargain." Amanda looked at Nathan's frozen form, at the terror etched permanently on his face. Then she thought of Miguel, of the expression he'd worn in death. Had he seen something like this in his final moments? Had he encountered the jinn or something like it? Some ancient intelligence that existed in the desert's empty places? "If I refuse?" Nathan remained suspended for eternity. "And you?" Soraka smiled, an expression rendered in flame. "You will never leave this circle. I may be bound to the grimoire, but within the ritual space, I have dominion. You will remain here, aging but never dying, conscious but never escaping, until the desert wind eventually erodes you to dust. It might take 1,000 years. Those aren't real choices. They are the only choices available to those who summon without preparation. Did you think magic was safe? Did you think the old powers would bend to your will simply because you spoke their names?" The jinn's voice took on a mocking tone. "You humans and your arrogance. You find ancient texts and treat them like curiosities, like museum pieces. You read the words without understanding the weight they carry." Amanda's mind raced, searching for options. She had no protection, no copper wire, no Solomon's seal. But she had something the jinn might not have anticipated. She'd spent 2 years studying trauma, learning about dissociation and fragmentation, about how the mind protected itself from horror by compartmentalizing experience. "I'll make a different trade," she said. "You have nothing else to offer." "Yes, I do. You want freedom, but you also want something else. You want someone to know your story. You want someone to understand why you were bound, what you did that made the sorcerer trap you." The flames flickered, interest sparked. "You presume much. All intelligence craves recognition. That's universal, human, animal, or jinn. You've been trapped for 700 years with no one to witness your existence except the occasional fool who reads the summons. But I'm different. I'm a ranger for the National Park Service. My reports go into federal databases. My photographs become part of permanent archives. If I tell your story, it will exist in records that last centuries." "Words," Soraka said dismissively. "Digital vapor. Better than nothing. Better than being forgotten entirely." Amanda pressed on, sensing weakness. "Release Nathan and let us both go. I'll document everything, the grimoire, the symbols, the ritual. I'll make sure your story is preserved. And in exchange, you get what every imprisoned entity wants: to be remembered, to have your existence acknowledged." The jinn was silent for a long moment, the flames that composed its body flickering uncertainly. "You would tell them about me? About what dwells in the empty places?" "I would tell them everything. I would make sure people understood that the desert contains more than sand and heat, that there are old powers here, bound by rituals and seals, waiting for the right words to be spoken." "And you think this serves me? Warning them away?" "I think," Amanda said carefully, "that you're lonely. 700 years is a long time to exist in isolation. even for an Ifrit. You want to be seen, to be known, even if that knowledge comes in the form of fear. It's better than being forgotten. Soraka studied her with eyes of flame. Then slowly the jinn began to laugh. Not mockery this time, but genuine amusement. You are clever for a human, and perhaps you are right. Perhaps being remembered as a terror is better than being forgotten entirely. The flames surrounding Amanda began to recede. Through the dissipating fire, she saw the desert reasserting itself, the black sand fading back to normal, the 3 copper suns collapsing into one yellow star, the impossible heat retreating to merely brutal. Nathan Drake's frozen form shuddered and solidified, becoming flesh again. He collapsed to the sand, gasping and whole. "I release you both," Soraka said, its voice fading. "But hear this, Amanda Castellano. You have made a bargain with an Ifrit, and such bargains have weight. You will tell my story, or I will find you again. Words have power. Names have power. You spoke mine, and now we are bound, not as servant and master, but as chronicler and subject. Do not fail in your obligation." The flames vanished completely. Amanda stood alone in the center of the stone symbols, the grimoire at her feet. Nathan Drake coughing and retching nearby. The temperature was still 115 degrees, but it felt almost cool after the supernatural heat. She ran to Nathan, checking his vitals with shaking hands, pulse strong, breathing steady, pupils reactive. He was dehydrated and probably hypothermic despite the heat. His skin was cold to the touch, his core temperature dangerously low. Amanda pulled her emergency blanket from her pack and wrapped him in it, then keyed her radio. "Castellano to base. I've found Nathan Drake. He's alive but needs immediate medical evacuation. Requesting helicopter support at my coordinates. Over. Copy that, Amanda. Helicopter en route, ETA 20 minutes. What's his condition? Over." Amanda looked at Nathan, who was staring at her with eyes that held too much knowledge, the kind of knowledge that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He'd seen what lay between worlds. He'd existed in suspension, conscious but unable to move or scream or escape. That experience would mark him permanently, just as Miguel's death had marked her. "Severe dehydration and exposure," she said into the radio. "He's going to need extended observation. Castellano out." She sat with Nathan until the helicopter arrived, neither of them speaking. What was there to say? They'd both encountered something the modern world insisted didn't exist, and they both knew that trying to explain it would only result in psychiatric evaluation and skepticism. When the helicopter touched down and the paramedics loaded Nathan onto a stretcher, Amanda gathered the grimoire, wrapping it carefully in the silk cloth. This was evidence, but evidence of what? She could file it with the incident report, could document the stone symbols and the ritual circle, but who would believe her? Who would accept that ancient Islamic magic was real, that jinn existed, that the desert contained powers that predated human civilization? She thought of the bargain she'd made, to tell Soraka's story, to ensure the Ifrit wasn't forgotten. That meant making a choice. File an honest report that would destroy her credibility, or file a sanitized version that protected her career, but violated her agreement with an entity that could reach her anywhere. In the end, Amanda did both. The official report was bland. Nathan Drake had experienced severe heat exhaustion leading to disorientation. He'd wandered from his campsite in a delirious state and was found unresponsive, but alive. The stone symbols were noted as evidence of Nathan's psychological state, ritualistic behavior consistent with heat-induced delirium. The grimoire was logged as personal effects and placed in evidence storage. But Amanda also wrote a second report, unofficial and detailed. She documented everything: the footprints that ended at nothing, the voice on the radio, the summoning ritual, her encounter with Soraka. She included high-resolution photographs of the grimoire's pages, transcriptions of the text from Nathan's notes, GPS coordinates of the stone symbols. She encrypted the document and uploaded it to 3 different servers, ensuring it would survive even if she didn't. Then she added a final note. "To whoever reads this, the desert is older than you know. There are things bound in the empty places waiting for someone to speak their names. Respect that. Fear that. Remember Soraka, Ifrit of the spaces between, who was imprisoned 7 centuries ago and briefly freed by human curiosity. Remember that knowledge always has a price, and sometimes that price is paid in forms that exist between life and death. She saved the document and closed her laptop, feeling the weight of the obligation settling permanently on her shoulders. The Jinn had been right about one thing. Words had power. By speaking the names, Amanda had bound herself to Soraka's story, and that binding would last as long as she lived. Nathan Drake recovered physically within 3 days. Psychologically, the recovery would take much longer, if it ever came at all. He refused to discuss what had happened during his suspension, would only say that he'd existed without existing, and that the experience had taught him the universe was larger and stranger than any human mythology suggested. He left Death Valley and never returned. Amanda heard through mutual contacts that he'd moved to Alaska, as far from deserts as American geography allowed. She didn't blame him. Sometimes the only response to horror was distance. Amanda stayed. Someone had to watch the empty places to make sure no one else stumbled into a 700-year-old trap. She checked the coordinates of Nathan's campsite regularly, verifying that the stone symbols had been scattered by wind, that no new patterns had appeared. The grimoire remained in evidence storage, cataloged but not examined, locked away where curious minds couldn't read its dangerous text. But sometimes, on nights when the temperature dropped below 100 degrees and the stars came out in their millions, Amanda felt heat that had no source. She'd smell cinnamon and sulfur, would hear a voice speaking in a language that predated Arabic, and she'd know that Soraka was checking on her, ensuring she kept the bargain. She'd made a deal with an Ifrit, she'd documented its existence, and now she carried that knowledge like a weight, like Miguel's memory, like all the trauma that accumulated in the empty places where humans encountered forces they couldn't control. The desert kept its secrets, but Amanda Castellano knew one of them now. And knowing was its own form of binding, permanent and inescapable. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what Amanda will do next.